Please help us say thank you to our organizational sponsors, including the Hefferland Foundation, Affiliated New Thought Network, International New Thought Alliance, Science of Mind Archives and Library Foundation, Center for Spiritual Living Denver, Center for Spiritual Living Midtown, New Thought Philadelphia, Planned Happiness Institute, Summit Center for Spiritual Living, One Heart Retreats, Center for Spiritual Living on the Lake, Unity Kitchener, Unity Spiritual Center Ottawa, Om Center for Spiritual Living, Satya Center, Begin Within Ministries, Center for Spiritual Living North Jersey, Unity of Savannah, and the Center for Spiritual Living Seattle, as well as all of our individual donors. Thank you for being part of the New Thought Media Network. Please like, share, and subscribe. New Thought Media Network, positively inspiring.
New Thought Media Network is pleased to present The Inclusive Church, Ideas and Resources for Leaders of Multicultural Ministries. The Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown. Tuesdays at 12 noon Mountain Time. Join Tracy and her guests as they go deep and share practical tips and resources you can use in your ministry. And now let's explore the Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown.
Hey everybody, Tracy Brown here, and you are on the Inclusive Church, because we're all about creating spiritual communities where oneness is not confused with sameness. Thanks for joining me. If this is your first time joining me or watching the program, two quick inoculations or reminders for those of you who've heard it before. When I say inclusive church, I am not talking about church as a building or a piece of property. I'm talking about church as the people who come together to learn, practice, teach, share spiritual principle or spiritual belief systems. And when you hear me refer to this is what leaders do, I am not defining leader as minister. Hopefully, all ministers we know and work with are leaders. But in an inclusive community or an inclusive church, there are many, many other leaders, whether they are licensed or simply or laity or visitors and guests even can be leaders depending on the situation. So the focus here is, what do leaders need to know? What are some ideas and some resources for people who are leaders in multicultural ministries, multicultural churches? So today is another episode where it just felt really important to share some tips and some ideas and some reminders. And then in beginning next week, I'll have a series of guests again. But this is a toolkit episode. And in the toolkit episodes, then I really try to stay within 30 or 35 minutes so that you can get some really good value in a really short period of time, but you still have plenty of time to do other things. And so I'm loving that Anita is with us and Myrna is with us today. And if you are also with us, because I can see a few other people here, and you would like to say hello in the chat or in the comments, that would be great. And tell us where you are watching or where you are dialing in from. But again, this is a toolkit episode, so I'm going to dive in pretty quickly. The tools and the ideas for this week's session actually come directly from the book, Stained Glass Spirit, Building Spiritual Communities Where Oneness Does Not Require Sameness. And about almost exactly halfway through the book, there is a chapter that is called The Hard Truths for Team Leaders. And it's in the section of the book that is titled Inclusion Requires Action. So in the first part of the book, it's thinking about what do you need to know related to inclusion or being inclusive. And then in this section, it's really about, okay, now you understand the why. Here are some ideas for action, or here are some things you need to think about as you prepare yourself to take action. So Hard Truths for Team Leaders, the second paragraph in the chapter reads, for you to develop a stained glass spirit, spiritual community, it is critical that your staff and that your volunteer leaders not only understand the importance of inclusion, but also how you expect them to contribute toward that goal of being inclusive. So in this chapter, I don't know, I was getting ready to say my favorite part in this chapter, but I may say that again. So I really like this part. 3 things you should tell all team leaders. Anyone who is leading a team, whether they are paid staff or volunteers, if you want to have an inclusive community, an inclusive church, you got to tell them at least these 3 things, besides, what their volunteer job is. And maybe, you may have to give them some step-by-steps for actually doing the job of whatever team they're leading. But regardless of that, or in addition to that, there are 3 things you really need to tell all team leaders. Number 1, we expect you to have diversity on your team. You're like, we have to tell people that? Yes. Yes, you do. Because if they are not automatically inclined, or if they haven't been in a lot of environments where there are a lot of people who are different from them, they are going to gravitate to people who have a similar background, who communicate in a similar or comfortable way, who think the way that they think, who expect the same things that they expect, because we're wired for whatever we've been socialized to do or to believe. So the number 1 thing is tell every team leader without exception, there is an expectation that you will have diversity on your team. And you must be explicit about that. Don't think they're going to pick up on it just because they look around and maybe other teams have some diversity. Don't assume that, well, they believe in your mission and your purpose, and you're always talking about inclusion or being comfortable with and valuing diversity. Don't assume that they're going to connect that desire or that intention to their specific team. So, number one, of the 3 things you must tell all team leaders. Number one, say it with me. We expect you to have diversity on your team. Now, before I go to number 2, I will comment about the word diversity in case you haven't been participating with the Inclusive Church show, or you haven't been exposed to the stained glass spirit concept of leadership. When I am using the word diversity, I am talking about all the ways that we are different from one another, both genetically and culturally. And even though it catches me off guard sometimes, I forget that there are still people who, when they hear the word diversity, especially if me or someone like me is saying the word diversity, they assume we're talking about race. And we are talking about race, but race and ethnicity are only 2 ways that we might be different from one another. And if you are in a congregation or in a community where everyone is the same race, or most, 90% or 95% of your church community is the same race, and then you say the word diversity, there's still diversity. There's still a lot of diversity by background, by education, by age, by the way someone or people have been socialized based on where they grew up, city or rural, in the US or in Europe. All kinds of ways that diversity shows up. So, number one, we expect you to have diversity on your team. Number 2, 3 things you should be sure to tell and explain to all team leaders. Number 2, diversity brings both conflict and innovation. What? What are you talking about, Tracy? So many people think, well, I don't want to have a lot of diversity because it's hard, or it's so emotional, or it's going to create conflict because people are different from one another. That can happen. It doesn't always happen, but that can happen, especially if the person leading the team is uncomfortable with lots of diversity. So conflict goes with the territory because we have different backgrounds and different experiences. And as a team, we have to learn how to work that out. We have to learn about each other's preferences in terms of how we communicate, how we problem solve, how we make decisions to create something that works specifically for our team. And that conflict is a natural part of people who are different from one another coming together. It doesn't represent failure. It doesn't represent you're doing something wrong. In fact, a lot of times when you have conflict within teams that are very diverse, it's because you're doing something right and you're really inviting people to bring their ideas and their desires and their expectations forward. But you will have conflict and you will have innovation. Diversity brings both. In most cases, you cannot get to the innovation part if you fail to recognize and facilitate through the conflict. So why does Tracy say that diversity brings innovation? For some of you, that's probably like a duh, of course. Different people who have had different experiences and who have been socialized in different ways will come up with different solutions, will come up with different ideas about how to market to other people, will come up with different ideas about how to support people in your ministry who might be coming from different backgrounds. And so, diversity, number two, three things you should tell all team leaders. Number two, diversity brings both conflict and innovation. Now, if you are a really, really good leader in your community, in your spiritual community or church, you know this. And so you also know that you must provide people with the opportunity to develop the skills required in order to deal with the conflict and in order to encourage the innovation. But the starting point is in the three things you should tell all team leaders, that number two of diversity brings with it both conflict and innovation. Three things that you want to be sure to tell all team leaders. Number three, it's not just what you do, but also how you do it. This always makes me smile because I have worked in organizations and I have facilitated retreats and training and interventions in dozens more organizations where there's someone who is a problem or someone who is very difficult to deal with, but they're never held accountable for how they treat people because they make sales or because someone relies on them to get things done or because they are a good worker, but they may not be a good leader. And we're talking about three things you should tell all team leaders. You cannot afford to have someone who is a team leader where everything is their way or the highway, or where they don't communicate effectively and there's always a lot of confusion, or where they are the person who is very judgmental. And so when the deadline comes, no one can do anything right or well enough. Or if they are the person who they procrastinate, and then the team at the very last minute has to work ridiculous hours to make the event come off well, or to show up and there's so much confusion and chaos because the person wasn't acting as a leader. And we groom leaders in most of our spiritual communities. We are grooming leaders all the time, and we know we have to teach people how to lead because maybe they are not a manager or a supervisor, but they are there wanting to contribute, ready to contribute. And we see in them the ability to inspire others. Maybe it's their enthusiasm. Maybe it is their skill that they could then be teaching and modeling for others. So we know we have to actually groom, teach, and develop leaders. But it's really important. It's really important that you tell all your leaders, yes, I am depending on you to get things done. However, it is also important how you get things done. So those are the three things you should tell all team leaders. And And it's really important that you take responsibility for that, because then that's the only way you can hold them accountable. Like if you find yourself complaining about people who are leaders in your church and you have not actually groomed them, you've not ever told them what you expect, then you don't really have the ground to stand on to complain. And then how much harder is it to teach someone a different way of being when they've already been in that role for a year or two or 10, and now all of a sudden you want them to behave differently? So it's really important not to delay and not to avoid. So I'm going to share a little bit more about what's in the book, Stained Glass Spirit, about each of these three, and then I'll add a couple of other things, and then we'll be at our 30 to 35-ish minute point. So 3 things you should tell all team leaders on page 51 in the book, if you happen to have it. We expect you to have diversity on your team. Be sure your team leaders, whether staff or volunteers, are aware of the expectation that diversity will exist on every team. In addition to the benefit of generating a broader pool of ideas and tapping into a greater percentage of your community or your congregation, this offers additional advantages. Teams that represent diversity educate people on the broader definition of diversity and also allows people to develop stronger skills in communication and in conflict resolution as they transform together or transform diversity together into harmony and inclusion. Number 2, diversity brings both conflict and innovation. I really did explain it pretty much, but I'm reminded of this part that's on page 52. If we're lucky, we find ourselves in our long-term relationship with a friend, a work team, or a romantic partner that is important enough for us to seek out communication techniques and supportive behaviors that require us to both acknowledge and recognize our differences while staying committed to each other's success. But all too often, we don't have these skills. Your team leaders might not have these skills. And even if you and your team leaders have these skills, there will be volunteers who do not. So this is why you can't just leave it to chance, and you can't just, maybe once a year say, we believe in inclusion. Inclusion is the way that we demonstrate oneness, or inclusion is the way that we demonstrate love for all of humanity, for all of God's creation. And you can say that once a year, but people will not automatically know how to translate that into their role as a team leader. I love the story that I chose to be in the book, and the short version, the Reader's Digest version of it is, I served on a board once, and the board was full of very high-powered leaders and people from many different walks of life, but quite a few of the board members, we had attorneys, we had a doctor, a medical doctor, we had 1 or 2 people who were academic, PhD doctors. We had some people who were experienced in leading nonprofit organizations. And we had a few people who were very, very wealthy and were accustomed to, just making difficult decisions and setting priorities. it was a great board. And when I joined the board, there was the president of the board the year I was added to the board was someone who actually I had a lot of respect for and the work she had done in the community for decades. But the culture of the board was that all these people with all this experience who had been asked to come on this board because they were leaders in their own environments, the culture was wait till the board president says what she wants and then just say yes. It was very much rubber stamp the ideas and the energy and the priorities of the individual board president. Well, anyone who knows me knows that I know how to go along to get along. And if you ask me a question or if you ask me for my ideas, I think you mean it. And so I tell you what I think. And it didn't take long for me to get labeled by the board president as I was not a team player. I was difficult to work with. And every idea that I then began to share when asked would be immediately shot down with no discussion. And people were just unwilling. And I didn't see myself challenging her. I saw myself stepping into the role of a board member who has been asked to bring ideas and leadership and blah, blah, blah. So what was challenging, which I write about in the book, is that other board members started coming to me and telling me what they thought or what they didn't agree with. And I would always say, well, why are you telling me? Like, go tell the board president, right? She's the one whose idea it is. And they would say over and over again, different people, oh, but you're not afraid to speak up. That's why I'm telling you. Yeah. So in that year on the board, it was challenging, except I had been in similar situations before, so I wasn't immobilized by it, but I found it fascinating. And so you can't assume that your board member, that your volunteers and on your team leaders are going to have the skills to actually invite different ideas and then to deal with the fact that when you have a lot of ideas, they don't always come together. You have different people. They don't automatically fit in together. And the great leaders we have that are inclusive are the ones who are able to bring those things together. And to keep in mind how culture influences that, because different cultural norms around conflict, around speaking up, different cultural norms related to actually believing that my ideas are valuable. All of that is at play. And for me, that's fun. It's like, oh, let's get in the sandbox and figure it out. But for most people I've met, it's irritating, it's difficult, it's challenging, and can also often make people say, well, I just won't volunteer. I just won't do it. And so we as leaders have to be able to not only tell people what we expect, but support them in developing the skills. Number 3, it's not just what you do, but also how you do it. Again, in the summary, I already mentioned how often this happens, that we have people who get things done, but the process they use or the style of communication and execution they use is not one that works with the people they are leading, that they have been assigned to lead. So I'm just scanning. Is there? No, I think I already summarized that. So this section in the book is a really good reminder for you, for me, that if I'm going to hold my team leaders accountable, whether they are paid or whether they are volunteer, I've got to be willing to say to them, inclusion is important. And here are three things in addition to doing the job that I invite you, if you want to be nice, Tracy would say, I expect you to be an example of our ministry's commitment to inclusion. And let's talk about what are some of the things that you can do and say in the role that you have that will demonstrate your commitment. If any of that is helpful for you, the other information that's in that chapter really gives you some ways, 4 ways that without making anybody a target, you can find some patterns that might be affecting whether or not your volunteers are experiencing inclusion from the people who are your team leads. And so I go into a lot more detail, but in the book, I talk about really watching for patterns where teams are stagnated. You've got the same people on the team year after year after year. Sometimes that's an indication that other people or people with a different style or different ideas don't feel welcome. It could just be that other people are not ever invited, but often it's that someone has expressed interest and they never got a call back, or because it's like, oh, we don't need anybody right now. Or somebody has expressed interest and they come to one meeting or one event and they don't feel like they've been included. And so they will just kind of disappear. So team stagnation. Number 2, team turnover. Now, a lot of us immediately recognize, wait a minute, that person, that team leader, whoever goes on that team, they go away really fast. They don't stick around. And that happens over and over and over and over again, that team leader can't keep people on their team. So that could be an indication. And number 3, reviewing your graphics. So don't be afraid to every 6 months or so, look at the graphics for anything you've put in, so all the things you put in social media, anything that you put in print, flyers or postcards. What are the images there? And so do you have enough variety in your images that different kinds of people could say, oh, I might fit in there, or that's someplace that looks like they have a lot of diversity, so I don't have to worry about being just like everybody else. And then the 4th thing is surveys or questionnaires or polls. Polls can be done, 1 question poll in your social media, or 3 questions in email, with a link that people can fill out in 3 minutes or 5 minutes. And you can do that again without targeting any individual leader, by asking questions about how people feel in terms of being included. You can also do surveys with visitors and first-time attendees. Again, 2 questions, 3, definitely no more than 4. And you have to keep it really, really simple. But it's a way for you to get feedback and input without putting anyone on the spot. So those are 3 things you should tell all team leaders. And yes, you actually do have to adapt it to your community. So I love what Myrna has said, that she likes the word expect, but with the cultural overlay of people that she engages with, she may have to use invite. And I would just say I'm really aware of that in my word choice with different groups. And if I am the person that they report to, or that I am the one who decides, then I might use the word expect, but I might not say I might say we, or in this community, we expect all team leaders to do this because, so they don't personalize it to me, thinking it's just Tracy's personal idea. And I'm careful about invite, because invite means I'm inviting you and you have an opportunity to say yes or no. And they can work perfectly, because if you have a method for giving every team leader feedback at least once a year, then you can invite someone in 2024. I invite you to try this. And then in 2025, when you're having a kind of a one-on-one check-in, how are things going? Then you can say, I invited you to do this because we have a standard of this and it's not working. So now, by the time we meet next year, here's what's working, here's what's not. And there is an expectation. You can also use the word, here's the opportunity for you to grow and to be more effective in this role. It's an opportunity for you to develop new skills that you can use in all parts of your life. Another word that sometimes I use in that same kind of general context of I expect, or we expect this from you, is to say, oh, we are implementing these 3 standards for all team leaders. And so let's just talk about how you would demonstrate or exemplify or incorporate this standard in what you do. And then they end up actually saying, well, I would do this and this and this, and then I'll hold them accountable for that. So there's all kind of little tweaks on this idea of expectation. But the expectation that I set up for you in terms of what you can expect from me today was that this is a toolkit session around things that you really must tell, hard truths for team leaders. And I invited you to expect that I would stay to about 30 to 35 minutes once I started into the conversation. And I am exactly at 32 and a half minutes. So that means it's time for me to end the show for this week and remind you that coming up in the month of July, we're going to be focusing on engaging and including people with disabilities in your spiritual community. So 3 of the 4 weeks we'll be talking about that, and I'll be talking with different guests, including some of you are familiar with Reverend Dr. Raymond Anderson, and we'll be talking with him about including people who are deaf and understanding deaf culture as you become more inclusive in your spiritual community. I'm so glad that you joined me today. My name is Tracy Brown. This is The Inclusive Church, and I hope to see you again next Tuesday or sometime soon right here on the New Thought Media Network.
Thanks for watching The Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown. Join us again next week at 12 noon Mountain Time.
of African Descent New Thought Group proudly presents Celebrating Our Soul, Consciously Creating Change at Unity Village, Thursday, August 1st through Sunday, August 4th. Some of our greatest keynote speakers, some of our finest musicians and vocalists, some of our amazing and experienced panelists, and some of our fabulous masterclass presenters will be there for you at Celebrating Our Soul, Consciously Creating Change at Unity Village this summer. Regular registration ends June 30th, so don't delay. Register today at padntg.com. Sponsorship opportunities are available at padntg.com. Volunteer opportunities are available at padntg.com. Go there now, padntg.com.